So, hello and welcome everybody to our Fronius International webinar today. We have the topic Fronius Smart Meter today. So, how we do the correct installation, the correct cabling, and how can we use the data. So, I hope you're all doing well. And before we start, I quickly want to introduce ourselves. So, my name is Christoph Schirlinger. I'm from Team Trainings and Education here at Fronius International, and I will guide you through this webinar today. And at the other end of the line, there is my colleague Michael Raunig, and he's responsible for the chat today.
Hi, Christoph. Sorry to interrupt you, but you need to play your screen that we can see your screen also.
Oh, sorry, didn't click that apparently.
Yeah, that's it.
So
perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. So let's close this one. So yeah, as I mentioned, or as you have heard him, my colleague Michael Raunig, he's also in the line and responsible for your questions. So if you have any, don't hesitate, send them through, and Michael is then trying to answer them as quick as possible. And also at the end of the webinar, we take a few seconds time to answer a few of your questions live. Well then, let's head on to the agenda. And as we can see at the beginning, we dive right into the Fronius Smart Meter TS and the technical data. The TS actually stands for touch screen, which we can clearly see on the picture on the right here. And the Fronius Smart Meter TS is slowly but steady replacing the currently available smart meter. So it's not from one day to the other. So there is a traditional, that there is a time in between, of course, but there is, in fact, then the new Fronius Smart Meter TS, which will replace then the standard one. So if you're wondering, okay, I have now the old smart meter available at my market. So this webinar will focus on the smart meter TS in terms of technical data and so on. But in theory, that the general use of the data and how it's pictured in SolarWeb and so on, that's both for same devices. So the theory behind both of the devices is the same. There are a few differences, but not that much. Okay, so that's our start. And then we go to the next topic, energy profiling and visualization. Energy profiling actually means the use of multiple Fronius smart meters in a system. And there we tell you what's the actual benefit and the difference. Yeah, then we head on to the installation, of course. We need to know how to correctly cable it and what about the data communication. And then the next step would be commission the whole system. On one hand, we look at the new Gen 24 inverter, but on the other hand, also on the Snap inverter, because it will be compatible to both of them. Yeah, and also there is the possibility to configure something on the Smart Meter TS, and we will take a closer look on when we need to do this and how we need to do this. And last but not least, we take a closer look into additional settings which can be set on a system which has a Fronius Smart Meter installed, for example, the dynamic feed-in limitation. But more to that later on. Yeah, so let's start with a short introduction of the Fronius Smart Meter. So what is the basic function actually? The Fronius Smart Meter is a bidirectional meter and is actually a base for our visualization on Fronius SolarWeb. So Fronius SolarWeb is our online portal where our systems are visualized, so visible for our customers, also for the installers if they want. And it can be used for analysis, but also for service purposes, of course. And with the Fronius Smart Meter installed at the feed-in point, for example, of this household, of the system, we have a clear overview of the whole energy flow. So where do we have feed-in, where do we have consumption, how high is the consumption, and so on. So it's a clear visualization for the customer. And by bidirectional, we mean it measures in and differs actually between both the consumption and the feed-in into the grid. So it can differentiate and then send the data accordingly to the Gen24 inverter or to the SNAP inverter, and is then going online onto Fronius SolarWeb. Yeah, and we have, of course, different types of smart meters. For different systems, there are different types. We start with the left one. It's the 100 amp single phase smart meter TS. For residential systems, of course, we can see here the possible AC cable cross section connectable is from 1 to 16 square millimeters, and the three phase smart meter type for that is then the middle one, 65 amp smart meter. Also for residential systems, three phase with the same AC cable cross section actually. And then we have for the commercial sector actually the 5 kiloamp smart meter. So it differentiates by the 5 kA on the one side, and also we need to use the external current sensors on this one. It's pictured down below here with these current sensors. It then can measure and deliver the data. AC cable cross section here a little bit smaller because we only need the connection to the smart meter here for voltage measuring from 0.05 to 4 square millimeters. So then, of course, there are different ways to install it, or actually the location can differ. Whether you want it on the feed-in point, like it is shown here, this is actually the recommendation for positioning the Fronius Smart Meter. So we are coming from the grid, from the right here. And first of all, we have, of course, our utility meter as usual. And then after the utility meter, there is usually a sort of post meter protection, like a fusing in between. And after that, we usually recommend the Fronius Smart Meter to be set, because that's actually the central collection point. And from there on, we have our consumptions connected and also our production, in this case, the Gen24 inverter. So by placing it in this position, we have it perfectly fit. It also can be used there, or it's mandatory to position it there when we talk about the backup system or a battery system. When we want to do one of those two things, we need to set it on this position. Yeah, and the second position where we can set the Fronius Smart Meter is actually the consumption path. If it's for some reason not possible to set it on the feed-in point, it's also possible to set it here in the consumption path. But please, if it's possible, do it on the feed-in point. Yeah, we initially talked about the energy profiling, which is actually the use of multiple Fronius Smart Meter in a system. And as an example, we have here a Gen24 inverter with a battery connected. We have a Fronius ohm pallet connected also for producing hot water with surplus energy. And for that, we need, of course, the primary smart meter. That's the reason why the inverter knows how much surplus energy we have in the system. And in this case, the customer also decided to have a secondary smart meter in the consumption path of this wall box. So he's got an electric vehicle and wants to know exactly how much energy he's charging up his electric car with. So, and for that, he simply places a secondary smart meter, which actually would be visualized like that on Fronius SolarWeb. So in yellow right now, the colors are changing in the near future, but in yellow would be the battery, in blue would be the ohm pallet, in green the surplus energy, and then we have this bar here, which would be, for example, the electric vehicle. So the secondary smart meter, just to be sure, is not pictured in a different color. In this schematic, it's the first picture we get when we go onto Fronius SolarWeb. But like we can see here in this next slide, there is the possibility to go on SolarWeb under the setting analysis. history, and then we can select per day, month, year, or in the total view, all the individual meters, and then they are pictured individually. So here, for example, we have a system with 3 or 2 different energy meters, one for air conditioning and one for electric stove, just to measure independently, and they can be pictured here independently then. So this would be 2 different ways then to show or visualize the secondary smart meter as well. All right, let's head on to the installation part for the Smart Meter TS. But before we come to that, of course, there is a talk about safety. Actually, it's very simple and straightforward. On the Smart Meter TS, we have 2 protection covers. The first one goes over the connection terminals of the phases, just to cover them up and to allow you as an installer to work safely on the terminal of the data communication, which is actually above here, and that secures you from touching any of the voltage lines. Yeah, and the second safety is actually a sealable terminal cover, which goes then over all of the terminals and secures everything. Then we have, of course, correct screw torque, actually different ones. So 2.8 Newton meter is on the measurement output of the single phase 100 amp and the three phase 65 amp. So on top of here, we are going into the smart meter coming from the grid, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6 would be then going to our loads into our household. And on these terminals, we have 2.8 Newton meters. The only difference is actually the 5 kiloamp smart meter, which only has 0.6 Newton meter on the measurement output, just because we don't run any load over this line. It's just for the voltage measurement. And for the data output, we have on all of our types 0.4 Newton meters. So, but now let's head on to the actual cabling and installation. We start with the Smart Meter TS 65 amp three phase. And like we can see here, or as I've shown you before, we are coming in from the grid with our three phases, and down below we go to our loads. And then we have above our display a connection point for the neutral. And as we can see as well, we have here pointed out a fusing, a fine fuse, 315 milliamps. That's actually not mandatory. Only if there is a regulation, a local regulation or a country regulation that says that you have to use one, then the 350 milliamp would be the minimum fusing that is possible here. Otherwise, it's not mandatory by Fronius. Yeah, and then we come to the second very important part, which is actually the data communication. On the right side, we can see a picture of the data communication card of the new Gen 24 inverter. And on this card, we have our orange terminal plug. And on this terminal plug, we have our Modbus RTU communication line. So for those of you who already know Fronius a little bit, Modbus RTU is the standard connection type between system components, let's say, and therefore also the smart meter. So it's a base 3-line communication. We have data plus, data minus, and ground. And here it's just named differently. It's called M0 minus and M0 plus. So data minus, data plus, and then the ground connection. And we go with these 3 cables to our smart meter on the dots 8, 9, and 10. So actually, one little hint on the Gen 24 inverter, we have a new feature. Let's say it's very beneficial in terms of cabling, because we have 2 separate terminals for our Modbus. So if we're talking about a system which is not only connecting a primary smart meter, but also a battery or an ohm pallet, where we also have a Modbus connection, then we can cable them differently on those 2 inputs. So we have M0 and M1. Both of them are connection terminals for Modbus RTU. So it's much more easy and much more convenient to do the cabling then. Yeah, and on the Smart Meter TS, we then have our 3 connection points as well. And then there are actually 3 important things to consider for the best data communication. The first one is use a shielded cable. That's what we can see here. Use a shielded cable for this data communication and ground the shield on one side. It's possible to do this on the Gen24 inverter. It has this specified shield connection point here. The second thing is always set the termination on the end of our Modbus line. So we have our Modbus RTU line is always a serial connection, and at the end of our line, we must make sure to set our 120 ohm resistor. That's to ensure the best data quality. So in this case, the data communication end would be the smart meter on one side, and on the smart meter, it's actually integrated already, this 120 ohm resistor. And that's on 0.7. So we simply need to make a short cable bridge from 7 to 9, and then we have set our 120 ohm resistor to on. And on the other side, on the Gen24 inverter, we simply have to do it by a small switch. Just switch it from position 0 to 1, and then we've activated it. So that's the second very important point. And the third one is actually not listed here, but in the next slide. Always use a twisted cable pair between data plus and data minus. For that, we recommend to use a Cat5 cable or a higher standard because they already have these twisted cable pairs inside. All right, so that's the first slide here for connecting to the Gen24 inverter. It's of course very similar when we talk about the connection to a snap inverter. The cabling is all the same on the smart meter, of course. Only the connection points are differently named on the snap inverter. It's called really data plus and data minus here. And for the ground, we have this minus symbol there. And when we come to the 120 ohm resistor, it's below the antenna of the snap inverter. Below the antenna, we have this little dip switch. It's a white dip switch here, which we need to set to the position on to activate it. But in all the other perspectives, it's the same as on the Gen24 inverter. Okay, so let's move on to our Fronius Smart Meter TS 5 kiloampere. So that's the big one for the commercial use. And there we have the small difference that we need to use the current transducers, as we mentioned, the current sensors. They are connected at the top of the smart meter here, per phase each. And yeah, also please make sure for the 5 kE smart meter, we need an external power supply, here pictured below via phase and neutral. It could be also supplied via DC, but of course, when we talk about an installation in the main distribution panel, there is already a phase and a neutral, might as well better use this one. So, but please make sure we need an external power supply in order to run this device, the 5 kiloamp. Yeah, when we come to the data communication, of course, it's very similar. Again, we have the 3 connection points here, and then the bridging for the 120 ohm resistor. And also on the Gen24 inverter, of course, it's the same regarding the resistor here. Yeah, but before we go into detail then on the commissioning, I quickly want to go through the fuse recommendation. Actually, it's only a recommendation. So when you need to use a fusing according to a local or legal regulation, then the 350 milliamp is actually the minimum rate. You can, of course, also use a higher fusing. It has to be accordingly to the used cross-section of this cable, of course, but for example, a 10 amp fusing can be also used then. Please keep in mind, if it's required, the 350 milliamps is the minimum rate. If you're using this fine fuse, we have a recommendation here regarding fuse holder. It's a thin rail mounting, very thin. Actually, it's only 8 millimeters wide, and therefore it fits really nice into the system and can be used there. All right. Yeah, one last slide about the data communication, or let's say a review of the most important topics. First of all, make sure to use the protection cover on the terminals of the phases when doing something on the data communication side. It's for your own safety. And the second thing I want to go through is the 3 important steps when it comes to the Modbus communication. The first one is listed here. Use a twisted cable pair between D+ and D-. It's standard for a Cat5 or a higher standard cable. That's the first topic. The second is the 120 ohm termination resistance on both ends of the power line, of the data line. So in this case on the smart meter and the inverter. And the third topic is ground the shield on one side. And that's it. Then we really made sure to have the highest secure data communication between those components. All right, now let's head on to the commissioning part, and we start with the Fronius Gen 24 inverter. And what we need to do there is actually, because we don't have a display there, we need to activate the access point on the Gen 24. And this is done by a simple click in the middle of this sensor. By clicking one time, we open the access point, and then we can connect with our desired device. So can be a laptop, a tablet, a smartphone, whatever. And by entering it, we have to set the password right. By entering this Wi-Fi, it's always the same, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if we are not using the app, we need to type into the browser this IP address, and then we come to the web UI of the inverter, to the own homepage, let's say, of the inverter. And if we're using the app, then we will be directly forwarded to this web UI. And when we go there, we simply need to add another component. So we go to device configuration, components, and then we say we want to add another component. Select the primary Fronius Smart Meter here, and simply choose the position. So if it's on the grid connection point, the feed-in point, or if it's in the consumption path. It's the same process also for the secondary smart meter. It's also simply add a component, select secondary smart meter then, and the same procedure then. It's also looking very similar when we talk about the snap inverters, because it's the same thing. We need to open the access point of the snap inverter, which is done with the display of the inverter, actually, in this case. So on the display, we say open the access point, we connect with our device, and then we go to the web UI again, and then we come to the point settings on the right side. And on the settings, we then have the submenu meter, where we then can select a Fronius Smart Meter. And by clicking on settings, it's actually opening this short side note where it states the actual state now. Okay, it's fine, it's working. It's also showing some data, consumption of 150 watt. And we simply need to select the location now, feed-in point or consumption path. We click OK, and then we're done. And it's the same procedure as well for the secondary smart meter listed below here. So we have different scenarios where we also need to do settings on the smart meter itself, such as when we use multiple smart meters in a system. The standard configuration of a smart meter for Modbus address is always set to 1. So if you're only installing one smart meter in the system and that's it, you don't need to configure anything because it's set as standard to 1 and it's perfectly fine. If we're using a secondary smart meter now, say in a consumption path of the wall box, for example, we then need to do the setting to do from 1 to 2, for example, and so on. And for this configuration, we have listed here now the process. So on our smart meter TS, we have 3 buttons listed here below the display. It's up, down, and enter. And for the first step, we need to press the enter button 2 seconds. It's opening then a list where we need to scroll up and down until we get to page 1. And then it's asking for the password. The password, it's a factory password. It's always the same. And it's 2633. We enter it. And then we select P14 with the up and down buttons. Then we go again to the enter button and hold it for 2 seconds. And then we go to this picture like here below. And it's actually saying address and the current set address. Here it's 1. As I mentioned, it's factory standard. And now we say, okay, it's a secondary smart meter. So we need to change this to the number 2. Then we go to the selection page 18 and press the enter button 2 seconds again for completion. And then we're finished. Yeah, so that's what we need to do when we have more than one Fronius Smart Meter in a system for the secondary ones. The second thing where we need to configure the smart meter is for the 5 kiloamp smart meter TS when we have the current sensors installed. Because current sensors, there are loads of it on the market, and of course they're all different regarding current ratio, and therefore we need to set the correct one. So for example, we have selected here a current sensor with the factor from primary to secondary side from 50 to 5. So it's actually a setting, a factor of 10, which we need to be set. So it's always different one, of course, regarding your choice of sensor, and it's also every time listed at the side of the sensor, or should be actually listed at the side of the sensor. And this setting, this factor, we need to set now. So again, enter for 2 seconds, select page 1 and enter the password. That's the same as before. And then we select page 4, press enter again, and then it says, okay, current transducer ratio. So we need to set there the number 10 then, in our case. We go back to page 18, press enter for 2 seconds, and then we are complete. So, and when it comes now to this choice of selection criteria of the current sensors, we have a guide for you. It's actually inbuilt in every manual, and you can also find it online. More to that in the next slide. But for selecting the current sensor, it's very important to select it right. So you need to make sure that the own consumption of the 5 kiloamp smart meter is about 0.5 volt ampere. That's the first thing we need to know. And the second thing is, of course, the length and the cross section of our line between smart meter and current transducer. So the power of the current transformer must be greater than the sum of the power of the Fronius Smart Meter, so the 0.5 volt amps, and the line resistance of the cable. So that's actually what we tried to list here for you, just as a short example. Of course, the thicker the cable gets and the shorter the cable gets, the less line resistance we have, and vice versa. But the sum of this number here in this table and the 0.5 volt amps of the own consumption of the smart meter should be the minimum selection criteria for your current sensor. Bigger is always better in this case. but this should be the minimum at least. Yeah, and when you want to know more about the selection criteria, please check out the info on our homepage. Just go on fronius.com and then you go to Solar Energy and Info Center, and there you can find this topic, installer support. And under installer support, you find every instruction manual, operating instruction, and so on, and also the one of the 5 kA smart meter TS. So there is also this guidance for choosing the right current transducer. Okay, now to the last topic for this webinar. It's about the additional settings which can be done. For example, the feed-in limitation. Yeah, we have here pictured the data from Fronius SolarWeb of a system which has currently activated this dynamic feed-in limitation. For example, in our neighbor country, Germany, they have a national-wide rule which states that they are not allowed to feed in more than 70% of the kilowatt peak of their system. It's a simple rule which everybody has to do so, and in this case, it just cuts off the produced energy above that. So in this case, or in such countries, it's of course very beneficial to do a high own consumption before it's cut off the energy. So, and this dynamic feed-in limitation is actually possible with Fronius, of course, and I want to show you now how to set it. So the first thing we want to take a look at is how we do it on the snap inverter. Same steps as before. We connect with our snap inverter, open the access point and connect to it. And on the setting point, we have here the submenu DNO editor. And down below, we can find this box here, dynamic power reduction. And just to make it a little bit bigger for here on the screen. So on the box here, dynamic power reduction, we need to set it on limit for entire system, select the watt peak of the system, the total watt peak, and then we can choose whether we want to set the power range in watt or in percent, which is the maximum of feed-in. So the maximum production power of the entire system can be then selected here. Short side note, please always hit this check button to save the settings and then proceed. And it's actually looking very similar for the Gen 24 inverter. We also want to connect, of course, to the web UI of the inverter by opening the access point. And here, for example, it's also listed as dynamic power limit. We select limit for the entire system and select the total DC power and what we want to feed into the grid as a maximum. And that's it. All right, so let's step on to the conclusion of these slides. So as we've heard, with the smart meter, we have a few advantages. So the customer has, of course, a really good overview of this energy flows in the system. He knows exactly where does he have his consumption. Can he shift something, from example, from night consumption to day consumption? And for a system right now available is also the simulation here. We have two simulations right now online on SolarWeb, and they are based on the data of a Fronius Smart Meter. So if you have a customer and he's got a Fronius inverter and a Fronius Smart Meter at the feed-in point, and the system already running at least 1 year, this customer is now able to do a simulation based on those data for a battery or an own pilot, for example. So it's of course a really high benefit for the customer as well as for you as installer for sales conversations, that you say, okay, now dear customer, let's take a look on this simulation based on your data from the past year, and selecting here a battery, you would have an increase of 82% in autarky level, for example. or regarding the own pallet, it would be an increase in 45% of own consumption. And this is, of course, very interesting for the customer and on the other side also for the installer. So this is now available for the customer if he has the system already running at least 1 year and the data. So in conclusion, we have with the Fronius Smart Meter in the primary smart meter at the feed-in point, we have the base for a retrofit solution. So when it comes to a Fronius own pallet or a battery storage solution to be installed, and the customer already has installed the smart meter at the feed-in point, it's of course a really cool base because he doesn't need to do the cabling on this end. He just need to set the additional component and is fine then. And of course, regarding energy profiling, it's a very detailed analysis available for the customer. Remember, with energy profiling, we talk about the use of multiple Fronius smart meters in a system for individual consumption and additional production paths. Yeah, and of course, the most important thing, in my opinion, is the simple online monitoring available for the customer and also for the installer, because it's showing all the detailed system data on Fronius SolarWeb online. Yeah, so that's it actually for this webinar. Before we go into the questions, I want to show you where you can find further information if you're interested. So regarding commissioning of the Smart Meter TS, please check out our homepage. Just under the search function, you can select Smart Meter TS, or as we have shown before, the installer support area. There, everything you need to know is listed, also the operating manuals and so on. And on YouTube, of course, you can find all the previous webinars. In fact, also this webinar today is uploaded to YouTube in the next coming days, probably. So if you want to review it, you can do this as well in the next few days. All right, so now I want to ask my colleague Michael, did we get any questions we could answer right now?
Thank you, Christoph, for this webinar. And I want to hint out here maybe about the fuses of 315 milliamp fuses. They were called during the webinar. And there was a hint about the fuses that they have to be installed. So please let me give a hint here. These fuses are regular argumentation. So in the case of there is local regulations that need to be fitted, you can install these fuses. This is just in case if there are some local regulations in your country. So please make sure to fit these local regulations. If these are the case, then please install these fine fuses with 315 milliamps. Besides from that, I want to give you an organizational hint. You will get the recording and the presentation of this webinar sent to your email address after the webinar. So even if you were not live at this webinar, you can always watch it afterwards and of course on our YouTube channel. Furthermore, for the last words, I want to hand back to you, Christoph.
All right, thank you, Michael, for these questions and answers. So in conclusion, regarding this fusing, I get it that it can be a little bit confusing, of course. So to sum it up, you don't have to install the fusing unless there is a regulation that tells you to. That's the whole point about it. All right, so thank you again also for you for listening, for joining in today, and also for sending us your questions and feedbacks. Thank you. And yeah, in this case, we see you next time, maybe on the next webinar, maybe the next training also here in Wels. We start with end of August, start with September, kind of like that, with our trainings here in Wels in Upper Austria. And until that, stay safe and see you next time.